Okay. Okay. Um, Good morning, fellow researchers. I am Loveth Bona, master's degree student of the Institute of African and Diaspora Studies, University of Lagos. I have made a slight adjustment to my topic. So instead of Igbo root spiritualities, the rebirth of ancestral worship in Igbo land, my topic is now religious shift among Igbo youths, the resurgence of traditional worship. So it's basically the same thing, just paraphrasing, right? So going over to my introduction, please the slide. Hello. So, all the so just concentrate on this. There's a panel going on for youth coming. I know the Japan. Yes, they have been moved to that downstairs. So just concentrate on this. I think she's once there so that camera can see. Okay. Okay. So the topic is religious shift amongst Igbo youths, the resurgence of traditional worship. Now, over to my introduction. Kindly move to the next slide, please, my introduction. Right, so it is common knowledge that the advent of colonialism in Africa resulted in the marginalization. Okay, so it is common knowledge, right, that the advent of colonialism in Africa resulted in the marginalization and decline of African traditional religion. The 21st century, however, has witnessed a resurgence of interest in traditional religious practices, right? And its cultural significance. And this is driven by efforts to preserve and reclaim African traditional practices, African traditional systems, and also to challenge negative stereotypes that are associated with indigenous African practices. Now, it is very important to note that the Igbo tradition is deeply rooted. The Igbo traditional religion is deeply rooted in its culture, right? And this is passed down orally from generations to generations. Now, the Igbo traditional religion worship, right, centers around three basic elements, which are God, non-human spirits, and reverence and veneration for ancestor worship, right? So these non-human spirits, right, are associated with nature and human experiences, such as Allah, known as the goddess of the earth, Amadioha, known as god of thunder and lightning. So all of these elements come to play, you know, when it comes to the Igbo traditional worship. Now, it is very important to note at this point as well that the ancestors are very important to the Igbo traditional religion. And that's the reason the reverence and veneration of ancestors plays a key factor, is very significant in this traditional religion because they are considered as powerful intermediaries between God and the living. And they are seen as representatives of God, guardians, and intercessors, right? Now, let's move over to the theoretical framework. Right. So the resurgence of traditional religion among the Igbo youths can actually be viewed through the lens of Afrocentrism, right? And Afrocentrism is a theory that dates back to the earliest Black nationalist movements, such as Pan-Africanism, right? Now, Eurocentrism centers the experiences and peoples of Africa around their own historical, cultural, and social context, right? So they debunk the fact, Afrocentrism debunks the fact that Africa had no history without the advent of the colonial masters, right? Now, Afrocentrism provides a framework to understand this resurgence as a conscious effort to challenge the Eurocentric religious beliefs and ideologies that have been imposed on African society during the colonial era, this is what Afrocentrism would help us to understand. It will help us to understand how this resurgence, this rebirth, this renaissance of traditional worship is a conscious effort, is an intentional act to challenge the dominance of Eurocentric ideologies and Eurocentric religious beliefs. Now, let's go over to the methodology of my work, right? So this paper seeks to understand the actual motivations and factors that are responsible for the return of traditional religious worship particularly amongst Igbo youth, right? And it also seeks to understand how these traditional practices, right, can coexist and revolve within the realities of modern society. As such, data was gathered from primary sources, such as interviews with actual individuals who have successfully transitioned from Christianity to traditional religious worship, right? Data was also gathered from secondary sources through online testimonials about people who have actually also successfully moved from being a Christian to being a traditional worshiper, right? Now, going over to my findings. The resurgence of traditional worship among Igbo youths. Now, the little research that I did, actually, the research that I conducted revealed that reconnection to ancestral heritage, self-discovery, reclamation of the African identity, revival of lost culture of Igbo, of the lost culture of the Igbo, deception of church ministers, as well as existential needs, were recurring themes, you know, for the revival of traditional worship. So all of these things kept on recurring as reasons why people have abandoned Christianity and rather sought to go back to their own traditional worship. Now, each of these things will be discussed very briefly. First, reconnection to ancestral heritage, right? Now, findings reveal that individuals are returning to African traditional worship in order to discover their ancestral roots. As a result, they engage in self and cultural exploration, right? Through learning about their ancestors' histories, their ancestors' ways, their ancestors' beliefs, and then establish a spiritual connection with their ancestors through prayers, offerings, as well as communication for guidance, protection, and blessings, right? Now, over to the second theme that keeps recurring, which is self-discovery. Now, engaging in traditional worship provides youth with a profound sense of identity and belonging, right? And cultural understanding as well, as they explore these beliefs, traditions, and values. So they begin to feel this sense of identity, this satisfaction, which also strengthens their self-awareness and cultural identity, right? So self-discovery is one reason that people are abandoning Christianity and returning to African traditional beliefs. Now, reclamation of the African identity. It's very important to know, and as this research found out, that the return to traditional worship is actually seen as a powerful act of resistance against colonial influence, also combating historical erasure of African values, erasure of African cultural heritage, and finally, also affirming the value and autonomy of African cultural heritage and African traditional beliefs. Now, this is one thing that this return is actually doing, and this tends towards actual decolonization. Now, these people returning to traditional worship are saying that no, the African traditional belief system is not as evil. It's not evil as has been portrayed by the Europeans, but it is something that brings about peace, that brings about satisfaction, that brings about an actual sense of identity and belonging to a culture. Now, over to the next one, which is revival of lost Igbo culture. I had earlier said at the beginning that the Igbo traditional religion is deeply rooted in its culture. And as such, people who are returning back to Igbo traditional belief system are those who actually want to reconnect with the Igbo culture, thereby reviving it, reclaiming, preserving, and celebrating the cultural heritage of the Igbo people, right? And this in turn fosters a sense of pride, belonging, and as well fosters cultural continuity, because it is being said today that amongst all the tribes in Nigeria, the Igbo tradition or the Igbo culture is one culture that is losing itself, that is losing in terms of language and everything. So people are returning to the Igbo culture in order to revive the Igbo traditional belief system, in order to revive the cultural heritage of the Igbo system and to preserve it, reclaim it, and ensure that it still exists from generation to generation. Now, the next reason that kept recurring is deception of church ministers. Apparently, some of the people returning to African traditional religious worship are individuals that have, had negative encounters and negative experiences within the Christendom, such as deception, betrayal by church members, or even church ministers. As a result, they begin to question the authenticity of these religious institutions, right? Prompting them to actually seek what they believe is the genuine and the true way of worship, which is the way of worship that is rooted in the culture of the people, that's culturally rooted in traditional practices, right? So this trust within this trust for these religious institutions have actually led individuals back to traditional worship. And this way, they are able to reconnect with what they consider as their true identity and their true cultural heritage. Now, another very important point that actually popped up from this finding is that inability to meet existential and fundamental needs, was cited as reasons why people are actually moving back to African traditional religion. Now, this implies that lack or inadequacy in meeting fundamental needs have actually driven this return in order for these individuals to find some sort of satisfaction and fulfillment, right? Now, in conclusion, so with the upswing of African traditional religion, right, particularly amongst the Igbos, because the upswing of this African traditional religion is beyond the Igbos right now. The upswing, particularly amongst the Igbos, have actually led some practitioners to embrace certain media platforms in order to create awareness on these traditional belief systems. And this is one way they are able to coexist and evolve within the realities of our modern societies. Now, we could see a situation where ever since the colonial era, people have been ashamed to practice their traditional belief systems, right? And this is because of the stigmatization they are being subjected to. But right now, this reawakening, this renaissance has actually enabled people to embrace this and to come out publicly, no longer secretly, to profess their belief in their traditional roots, right? And they have adopted various media platforms. And this is the reason why I was able to get data from various online testimonies, right? Now, the embrace and promotion of African traditional worship is a powerful means to reclaim African cultural identity, as I have said, counteract colonial influences, and also foster healing from historical traumas, right? Now, we all know what Africans went through, all starting from the slavery down to colonialism. We know the dehumanization, the oppression that we face. We know how we were made to lose our identity. We know how our Black identity were thrown out of the window. So this is actually a way to foster healing from this historical trauma as well. Now, this traditional renaissance validates and celebrates diverse African cultures and also contributes greatly to the mission of decolonization, which is what this conference is all about. Decolonization, decolonizing the mind, decolonizing everything about us, from the colonial influence, right? And this also allows individuals to actually engage with spirituality on their own terms and not on the terms that the Europeans have actually sold to us. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Lovett. And a special thank you for giving us the opportunity to have this panel, because you can see that the rest are not here. We are looking at useful spiritualities. We've had debates the other day whether African traditional religion, whether there is a resurgence or whether it has been a resistance. And with the coming of social media gave it a kind of visibility. Thank you for that wonderful expose, but I have one or two problems. Number one is the images you use.
Okay.
Especially the last one, where you use that the image of that barrister.
Yeah.
Was actually the idea what the barrister portrayed. Was it actually do you think it actually fit into our discussion? Because I know that the problem with that particular dressing was that the debate on whether they wear hijab or not hijab.
Yeah.
And then it was what led to it. And what he did was that he decided, okay, if you allow anything into the courtroom, okay, let me appear like, does it actually portray, did it actually fit into our discussion? Or is it a good portrayal of what we are discussing? So that's because there's a difference to what he actually did. And then the second one, you talk about identity. So that slavery threw away our African identity, and then this resurgence is a kind of bringing them back. And I'm asking, what about our brothers in Brazil? I know that the Yorubas, they've maintained whatever the ancestral. Some of them are still coming back. The Brazilians are coming back. One of the festivals I read it up in Yoruba land. They always come every yearly to be part of that festivity. And what about our Jamaican brothers? These are slaves. They were taken away from Africa, but they went there and they kept maintaining our. How do you think if our people decided not to practice our traditional religion because of influence of Christianity, while our brothers who were forcefully enslaved still maintain that kind of maintain the religion in order to have a connection with their roots? How do you reconcile this?
Okay, first of all, talking about the picture, you asked if it actually relates to what we are discussing. Yeah, what we are discussing here is actually decolonization, right? And acceptance of who you are, right? Now, me using this picture is, okay, what led to this barrister actually coming to the court in this attire was when the court passed that the Muslims can actually go with their hijabs, right? And he says, okay, fine, since the Muslims are actually allowed to portray, their looks outside, then I should also be allowed to portray my looks outside. I am an African traditional religious worshiper. So this actually gave people who are also traditional worshippers to be able to come out. And this is the reason I said in my last slide, in my concluding slide, that the resurgence has actually adopted various media platforms to create awareness. So this barrister coming out like this was actually creating an awareness that, look, if you are a traditional worshiper, do not be ashamed to come out to show yourself. Since the Christians are not ashamed, since the Muslims are not ashamed, then we should not be ashamed because our traditional belief system are not religious. So that is how this relates to it, creating awareness and making other people to actually feel that, to actually feel comfortable coming out, with their looks and the practices. Now, talking about the Jamaican brothers. Now, when I say that slavery from slavery down to colonialism took away our cultural identity, yes, by the time we were snatched from our people, of course, we were made to lose our sense of culture. We're made to lose our Black identity because we were forcefully allowed to. Their cultures and traditions were forcefully imposed on us. Not just us, also the Jamaicans, also the Black people that you're talking about outside the country. But the moment they started regaining their freedom, these people started reclaiming back their identity, right? And this step is the step that some Africans are delving towards too, right? Are delving into right now. The thing is that for some people, they feel that, oh, okay, it's not enough to just reclaim my identity. I do not just want to reclaim my cultural identity. I also want to reclaim our religious identity that is all about ancestral worship, that is all about reverence for non-human spirits, right? I want to reclaim this as well, and not just the identity, because like I said, I am looking at Igbo communities, and Igbo communities, their traditional religion is deeply rooted in culture. So these people believe that for me to take back my culture, for me to identify rightly with my culture, right, I need to also identify with the religion, which is deeply rooted in the culture. Yeah, that's my reply to that.
Any further reaction?
I should pass it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that presentation, although I came in late, but I was able to get most of what you were saying. You said that young people or Nigerian youth or Igbo youth going back to their African traditional religion is a form of decolonization. So I'm asking, after decolonization, what next? After decolonization, what next? What is the impact of that decolonization? Is it just reclaim identity. After that, what next? How does it because to me, I love to see things in black and white. I love to see things in additions and subtractions. All right. So that's what I want to know. After decolonization, what next? How does that shape the Igbo economy, the Igbo political landscape? How does that shape it? Thank you.
Thank you. Chair, is it possible that we take all the questions so she can answer them one after the other?
Okay, thank you for the presentation. I'll just take you up last on the from where she stopped concerning this picture. Your topic is religious shifts among Igbo youth. Can you classify this man as a youth? This man here, can you classify him as a youth? Then secondly, you said you use both primary and secondary sources, meaning that you interviewed some people. That is to say that in the process of doing your analysis or carrying out your analysis, there should be some specific things that those people have said that you should at least bring out in relation to the points that you are raising. But you just did a general overview of everything. Are there specific things that are, who are those people you even interviewed? How many people did you interview? Where are they? Then in Igbo land, don't you think Igbo comprises Abia, Anambra, Enugu, part of Delta, which place again? Hey, they are all Igbo. So are you saying the entire Igbo? Don't you think you are generalizing? Don't you think you should be what we call scope and delimitation? You should streamline this paper. Don't you think you should just study Abia people, Abia youths, Enugu youth, saying the entire Igbo? I think is a kind of generalization. Thank you.
The question. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Lovett, for that wonderful presentation. Okay, thank you for that wonderful presentation. But I think my question is somehow linked to the question he asked. Based on the study you did, I am Yoruba. This is not about anything tribal, but I want to have more knowledge. And based on your presentation, I would appreciate if you can tell us, looking at the contemporary age we have and this decolonization, what's it called? This decolonization movement and journey, and considering the reawakening and renaissance you mentioned, do you think this ancestral worship, do you think there's a potential growth for them in this contemporary age, moving forward, maybe 5 years, 10 years? How do you think they can juxtapose this ancestral worship and Christianity and whatever religion we have in Africa or Nigeria at the moment? Where do you see this particular ancestral worship in like five years to come or 10 years to come?
Okay. All right. The first question says, after decolonization, what next? We need to understand that when we're talking about decolonization, we have political decolonization, we have economic decolonization, we have cultural decolonization. This particular paper speaks to cultural decolonization. People accepting who they are, people accepting rather their ancestral worship. So what next is people being comfortable, right? So this doesn't actually relate to economic or political. When we want to talk about economic and political decolonization, right? My paper could have spoken to that, but this is actually just limited to cultural decolonization, which is all about, having this sense of belonging, which is all about promoting cultural continuity, right? So this paper doesn't speak to economic and political decolonization. When you say, yeah, to your first question, can you classify this man as an Igbo youth? When she asked the question, I actually addressed something. Now, the reason I used this picture was because this picture actually creates an awareness, right, of the traditional belief system. It doesn't speak to the fact that he's the youth, but he is a youth, but it's creating an awareness that if you have decided to practice your traditional religion, you should not be ashamed of it. You should be able to come out and let people know, just like the Muslims are letting people know, just like the Christians are letting people know. You should also come out to let yourself be known, right? So this picture was speaking to the awareness being created, not necessarily that he is a youth. And at the end of the day, being a youth is a thing of the mind. The man may decide to actually identify as a youth, right? Now, when you talk about in Igbo land, I was very careful with my words when I was coining this topic because I knew that I wasn't going to, or rather, I didn't have the means to travel, right? That's why I said, let me go back to my slide. That's why I said, I coined it as religious shift among Igbo youths. I didn't say in Igbo land. amongst Igbo youths, right? So basically, we have Igbo youths scattered everywhere. I reside in Lagos, and we have Igbo youths scattered in Lagos. And the reason I decided to actually take up this topic was because I actually encountered people, like 3 people at least, that actually have moved from transition from Christianity to traditional religious practices. And I, got into conversations with these people. Some of these conversations actually have recorded on my phone, right? And it was based on all of the things that he said that I came up with that I used thematic analysis to bring out the recurring things from what they said. Now, this is not a full paper presentation. This is an overview of what the paper looks like. So I couldn't possibly have actually brought out each of the things they said from point to point. But looking at some of what the respondents said, some of them actually talked about, one of the respondents talked about Odinani, which is, I think, relates to ancestral worship. And it talks about Odinani. You reclaiming your ancestral worship helps you to define who you are. And this speaks to self-discovery, right? And he also talked about speaking directly with the ancestors, right? That speaking directly with the ancestors helps you to ask them for guidance. So he particularly said that I do not need the Holy Spirit to be my intercessor, that my ancestor is my intercessor, that what I need is to know my ancestors. And he also said something like, if I do not know my ancestors, that there are these 4 particular days, the 4 days in Igbo land that are very significant, which are the Eke, Ofo. All I need to do is to mention these days if I am praying, if I do not know my ancestors in particularly, that if I mention these names, the ancestors that were born in these days, right, would automatically be there to intercede for me, right? So, yeah, and some people actually talked about the mode of prayer, talked about purity, how you are supposed to, wash your hands before you embark on prayers with the ancestors, talked about, the significance of Ofo, significance of the Oji. And some people actually talked about, there's this particular person that actually said that because he was convinced that he is a reincarnation of his grandfather, that was how he believed in the fact that, ancestral worship actually still exists, and I am supposed to be practicing this ancestral worship. And also, yes, people actually said things, but because this is just an overview, I couldn't start pinpointing them one after the other in the presentation, but probably in my major work. Yeah, definitely in my major work. What other question? Yeah, to your question, do you think that there's going to be a growth, and how are they going to fit in with, yeah. And that's why I said that the upswing has led to a lot of people embracing the media platforms, right? The fact that they have decided to come out from secrecy to the public through various media platforms, most especially social media platforms, is actually putting them in that forefront. It's actually, actually shows or actually speaks to the fact that, in years to come, right, a lot of people will be able to actually coexist with the Christians, with the Muslims, and, even if they do not want to be accepted, they will enforce their own acceptance, right? Because they have decided that, I am going to engage my own spirituality on my own terms.
So, so thank you for your presentation. So first way that I missed part of the presentation. I just wanted to ask, because I think from what I heard, you didn't talk about Matthias Isiam. Where do you see Matthias Isiam in this kind of discussion? That's one. Then linking to the question that she asked. I think that culture is very dynamic and culture is not static. So if we are talking about decolonizing cultural just decolonization, and people are going back in time in quotes to adopt their traditional culture, their traditional form of worship, where do you see time and change? Change and opportunities coming in. Do you think that syncretism, between, let's say, Igbo traditional worship and, like Christian worship or even Islamic worship, you see syncretism becoming a kind of new traditional worship that people will be adopting? Because, culture is not fixed, right?
Okay.
Dr. Mbalis.
You can shoot. It's okay, you can talk. Okay. Sarah, yeah, you can hear it. So, the question I'm asking is the issue of the coloniality or the colonization of culture. Is this a reality? Because I'm asking the question, looking at the fact that the culture we are talking about, which we wanted to colonize, and to decolonize into what? Because if as she has said a beautiful conversation, if we go back to our ancestors, let me just ask this simple question. Do you think if our ancestors that lived in the last 200 years come back today, do you think they could be able to survive with it? Because the culture that is in existence now, they knew nothing about it. And it's not a part of their religion. So if we bring back what they practice there, and then we apply it to the present, let me just be specific, the 20th century dynamics, do you think it is going to fit in there? And also work for the people of the present generation. Thank you very much.
Mine is a kind of intervention. You see, it's an area I am deeply interested in. I have worked in this area for over 13 years. And sometimes the challenge we have in historicity is to use today to judge yesterday. Yeah. It's a very big error in knowledge, in historical knowledge.
Yes.
You don't use today to judge yesterday. Yeah. Because once you begin to do that, and you place Christianity before ATR, that's a fundamental error in history.
Yes.
Now, place ATR, that is indigenous to the Africa, before all other imported religions. Now you can analyze them and situate them where they belong. You see, it depends on perception and then the words that we use, how you understand decoloniality and how you understand African Renaissance. They are two different words. Yes. Now, if you say we are going back to the ancestors, which you know it is practically not possible, but we can, like you said, culture is dynamic. Now, I published an article and I called it Contention Between ATR and Christianity. In that paper, I simply argued, when Christianity came, the manner in which it was introduced, in fact, it was more or less like an imposition. You see, give this and take this. If you don't give this, you won't get this. Now, it wasn't so voluntary for people to accept it. Now, having water in a ship is different from having ship on water. There are two different things. So what we see now is when somebody begins to talk about his traditional religion, in which is indigenous to him, the sentiments of those who were born after colonial rule will be that, oh, you are going back to ancestral worship, you're going back to idol worship. The term paganism does not really mean one who is not a Christian. If I am a member of any religious sect, and you don't understand, you don't believe me, you're a pagan to me. Correct. If I'm a Muslim, you're a Christian, you're a pagan to me. Correct. So these things are syntax where people use words. Like I asked somebody, you say rape. I said, rape is not indigenous to many parts of Africa. Otherwise, give me another word in place of rape. You can say your hand for my tradition, for instance. Say hand is Zaka, head is Isi, for instance, for the Igbo. Now, when you say rape, without using a sentence, can you describe rape in Igbo? Sometimes because of the religious belief systems of the Igbo, the fear of the gods. Somebody said he went to the east and he saw thunderstorms, you know, getting very close to him. Say, yeah, that's why they always talk about Amadioha, because it is closer to them. Now, these are things that the environment imposes on societies and they are natural. All right. So from what she is saying, I was even going to suggest that you, instead of using limit yourself to Igbo youth specialities. Just use African specialities. And then you now look at the rebirth or the reemergence of traditional ancestral reverence and not worship. The difference between worship and reverence. That is what people do. They don't worship. What you call an idol is something that makes meaning to you. If your phone is too particular, it becomes your idol. Yeah. Look at the American Idol. Look at all those Nigerian idols. Does it mean they bring calf images to the television or you to worship them? So I want us to actually open our minds so that we don't begin to say, once want to colonize. If you listen to Patrice Lumumba, he says our traditional rulers and our judges, because they've abandoned the African way of conflict resolution and then adopted the court system, we now dress like Father Christmas in the courts. These are his opinions. We're not saying go back there. If you appear in class as a lecturer, you're wearing your normal abada, maybe tying up or something, some people may even laugh and call you, hey, Baba. You walk in suit and they say, hey, he looks good. These are things, it's just perception. So let us look at it widely so that we don't just make mistakes while we're trying to conceive things. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your taking over that you said. Now, you asked about sorry, I've really not come across this person. You said, I've really not come across this person. Yeah, I've really not come across this. So maybe I'll more about the rights. And then you also asked about it's appeared that
she can always improve. I can do this comment. This is not a room for people.
Yeah. So that's what making. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking about as well. So I'll go back to actually making more stuff on me. Now you also talked about syncretism, right? Now I want to actually understand that everything is actually a gradual process. We cannot say decolonization is not possible because we are seeing people doing it already. Yes, right. People are doing it already. Yes. So definitely, so we can't say it's not possible. And that is actually what we found this study. This study is why are people going back to traditional religious worship, right? So it's already existing amongst these other traditions, right? So people are reinventing it. And now this study is looking at why are people reinventing this, right? Which is actually talked about the fact that they want to go back to their belief. They want to rediscover their ancestral roots. They feel it's a form of self-sense. It's a form of, providing this sense of identity, belonging, and cultural identity as well. So it's something that is happening. It's something that is existing, right? But we still have a very few percentage of people engaging in this practice. There's this report from BBC that says just 3% of the population of the world, Africa, are actually practicing traditional religion. And with the way people are returning to traditional religion, we see that this percentage will actually increase as time goes on, right? And so somebody asked, is it a reality? It's a reality. That's the reason we have to carry out this research. If it's not a reality, this research was done very important and very interesting start, right? Decolonizing to what? Decolonizing to what they believe is the genuine history we had before the Western. Yeah, decolonizing to what they believe that we had in existence before the coming of the European masters. That is what they are decolonizing to, right? So those questions are actually, the answers are very obvious to them because it's something that we see, which actually becomes this. Okay, all right. I think that's
everyone that participated, not that they are not on the but then for this fact, and then we have the opportunity. Can I do a welcome? So, conference is the only person we have today. And then I'm taking my authority as the chair of this panel to call it to bring it to an end. Because I have another panel going to my coaching is there.
Bye. Thank you. So we'll be ending this session and we can have a discussion.